Welcome back to Coming Together for the Good. Hello, Dr. Jane.
Hey Anna, how are you?
I'm doing good. How about yourself?
Doing great. It's great to be
Well,
together again.
yes, it is. Great to see you. In our last conversation, Dr. Jane, we touched upon the many factors in the pandemic that caused the perfect storm for fear and trauma. You spoke mainly about fear, and I was hoping we could delve a little bit more deeply into trauma today.
I think that's a great idea. Anna, when we talk about trauma, we're really talking about um, an extraordinary kind of stress that overwhelms all of the coping capacity. And it shatters one's sense of safety and security. Um, and so, along with that, there's very often the experience of intense vulnerability. And following the incident, whatever that traumatic experience happens to be, um, there usually there's usually a period of intense emotions, sometimes intense um, um, memories from the incident, a lot of anxiety, sometimes flashbacks, which is a real kind of a full sensory reliving of the incident. And sometimes these don't go away. And so what happens is very often the individual finds themselves in a real sense of aloneness, a real sense of feeling disconnected, sometimes a numbness. And along with that, there tends to be this kind of prevailing distrust of others and also a distrust of the future. It's one of the pieces that very often we look for in diagnosing post-traumatic stress is what we call foreshortened future. It's like not being able to see oneself in the progression of moving into a future. So there's kind of this helplessness and hopelessness that goes along with it.
Yeah, well, what causes trauma?
Well, I usually think of three major categories that activate trauma. There's a single event trauma, there's a prolonged traumatic stress, and then there are also natural disasters. What's interesting is that everybody tends to interpret their experience differently within any one of these three. Okay, so someone might have a more intense impact even in the same situation. More intense impact might react differently than someone else. So it's very, very subjective. But the other piece is that trauma tends to run on a continuum of mild to moderate to severe. And so there, within the field of psychology, very often we refer to it as small t traumas, middle-sized traumas, and severe traumas or big traumas, big T traumas.
Yeah.
And again, this happens to do with an individual's own personal experience of what has happened to them.
Dr. Jane, can we go through each one of these? And
Sure, sure. When we talk about a single event trauma, we're usually talking about something that is unexpected, something that was a surprise, um, something like an injury or an accident, could be an assault, loss of a job. Sometimes when someone is given a serious diagnosis, they have a traumatic response to it. Illness, death of a loved one, these are all single event traumas. We're blindsided, it overwhelms the psyche and the nervous system, and things play out accordingly.
so the situation is like an ambush and it overwhelms the person.
That's right. That's right. That's a single event trauma. But then we have prolonged stress that can lead to traumatic stress. And the pandemic can be, a pretty good example of this because this is a protracted situation. Okay? It lasts very often a long time. Okay? Longer than anticipated. So if you recall, we have this overwhelm of the psyche, this overwhelm of the nervous system, this overwhelm of coping mechanisms, and rather than it being a single event, is over a protracted period of time. So this challenges and depletes the individual. So any kind of a long-term illness, also caregiving can be a prolonged traumatic stress. Toxic work environment, sometimes toxic family environments can also lead to traumatic stress. Um, Watching negative news feeds night after night. Social media can be so negative. These all can contribute to this kind of prolonged traumatic stress.
Yes, these really speak to the global experience of the pandemic.
That's right. That's right. And within this prolonged traumatic stress, there also is what I consider kind of a special population. And this is anyone within this group of prolonged stress who also has a history of traumatic stress prior to this particular stressful event. So, someone who has experienced violence or childhood abuse or has experienced vicious teasing or bullying are automatically going to be traumatized from that particular experience in their history of having this prolonged victimization. Sets them up to be much more sensitive, much more reactive, much more vulnerable to new traumatic stress.
So it's like another group who, because of past trauma, are even more sensitive to new stressful situations.
That's right, more sensitive and more reactive. And then we have the last category, natural disasters. And this is anything from fires to earthquakes to hurricanes to floods. It can also include societal violence and domestic terrorism. You know, this affects us um, individually, but it also affects us collectively. And what I mean by this is, you know, there are the firsthand experiences of people actually being at ground zero, right, when the event occurs. But there are also those of us who are watching it on the news reports and the pictures of it coming in and the testimony of people who are involved in it. We also can experience the traumatic express of that natural disaster kind of secondhand. And when you think about how, as a nation, how we reacted to the Twin Towers or even the recent riots, you know, it affected people not just on the streets, but also at home watching things play out.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Now, what happens to the person that's traumatized?
Well, let's just take a look at that, Anna, because it is about sensory overload. And it overloads all the systems, physical, mental, emotional, overloads all the systems. So what happens is there's kind of this psychic sensory shutdown, which is really kind of a built-in measure of the psyche to protect itself. The trauma kind of goes into a log jam, you know, in the neural system and can very often stay there. This helps the individual survive. Survival actually can take over, and parts of the trauma may move below perception and not really come out or not really be revealed until sometimes later on. You know, for other people, they tend to replay and can't help it, but the traumatic images continue to replay and continue to overwhelm the system. But many people do kind of disengage and dissociate from it. So the feelings and the memories kind of go underground and don't come out until later. And sometimes it can be like a sensory trigger that pulls it to the surface again. Something like a sound or a smell can all of a sudden pop those, traumatic memories into full awareness. And the individual is really overwhelmed by that experience that had been in that log jam, kind of buried in the psyche.
Sure, I could see why that would happen. Either way, it just all this sounds really awful.
Well, it can be very, very difficult because it can trigger intense, fear and sadness and grief, helplessness. People very often feel trapped. It's like they can't get out of the incident. Sometimes there's guilt involved and anger. Very often shame and a real lack of sense of control in one's life. And then the physical symptoms that generally occur are things like, sleeplessness is one of the hallmarks, nightmares and fatigue, a lot of irritability and anxiety, agitation, tension and restlessness also occur because one can't settle into a state of calm or balance. So a lot of body tension that can sometimes lead to actual body pain. Appetite is also affected, so weight gain, weight loss, increased use of alcohol and drugs, just to try to, ease the discomfort of it all.
Now, how long does this last? How long do these feelings last?
Well, it varies. Some get better in a relatively short period of time. That's not to say that it's not horribly uncomfortable, in that period. But people are more likely to get through it more quickly if they're willing to take care of themselves, take care of their physical and mental and emotional needs. but sometimes the symptoms persist, and it's really no fault of the individual, um, because it is so overwhelming that even knowing how one might help themselves becomes really blocked. And this is really what we call post-traumatic stress syndrome. And this is where professional help is very often necessary. Um, PTSD, as we call it, sometimes causes very obvious changes of behavior, but sometimes it's much more subtle, particularly if it's like what I mentioned about, going underground, because it's below perception and it only comes up every now and then. Or it might be that there are symptoms on the surface, but no one is relating it to the post-traumatic stress that's buried below. But clearly, we're a culture that says get over it, pull yourself up, get moving, and yet, stuffing it or the suppressing of trauma really doesn't get rid of the trauma.
Yeah, so suppressing the traumatic stress doesn't work.
Absolutely not. It just means that it's not available to conscious awareness, but the trauma is very often brewing below the surface. And some of the telltale signs, interestingly enough, arise when there are physical or medical issues that surface. Things like migraines, high blood pressure, anxiety and depression, autoimmune and inflammatory diseases very often have a link to unresolved trauma. And so medical professionals very often are baffled and unable to find the cause for some of these ailments because they haven't really had the clear connection of how they might be related to something in someone's history.
Yeah. So if a person is no longer conscious of the trauma, they may not even think to tell their doctors about it.
Oh, this happens all the time. You're absolutely right. So if there haven't been probing questions about the history, or if the patient has suppressed their traumatic history or somehow has framed it in, it's really not important, that was way back then, surely that's not bothering me, then it may never be addressed. And there can be life-altering symptoms that are a result from it, but it's never been identified. So one really can't move into any kind of post-traumatic recovery.
Well, what's involved in post-trauma recovery?
Well, the key is it takes time to heal. And the healing of trauma involves patience and also compassion, but these are often difficult to access when one is going through the experience of post-traumatic stress. Allowing the scary feelings to emerge, allowing them safe passage, is sometimes something that an individual just um, can't allow themselves to do. This is why professional help can be so very necessary.
Dr. Jane, what do you suggest for PTSD recovery?
Well, a couple of the basics, Anna, would be things like resuming one's normal routine. Um, and this is because it lends familiarity. It tends to be grounding. It adds some normalcy to one's life when there really has been this traumatic shakeup. And as I mentioned, it's also allowing the feelings to surface, without criticism, because there are really no right or wrong emotions. It's to allow them to move through us rather than stuffing. Um, is that requiring the safe passage, which is so often relies on self-compassion, which again is hard to access during these times of traumatic stress.
Yes, patience and compassion are so important. And what about social connections, Dr. Jane?
Well, I think the taking time to talk to trusted others, who are positive and supportive and don't try to talk us out of our feelings, can be incredibly helpful. Um, this is a tough space, though. It's a tough space for someone to hear the trauma. It's a tough space for the individual who's experiencing it to relive it or even to be able to admit to the feelings that are coming up. But this can allow the individual to feel safe and not so alone in this intense emotional turmoil.
Yeah. Now, what about self-care when they're in that emotional turmoil?
Well, I believe self-care is the cornerstone to any healing. And it's about making healthy choices, even when we don't feel like making healthy choices. So it's eating healthy, staying physically active. I can't stress enough how good sleep habits, how imperative they are. Good sleep hygiene, going to bed at certain times, awakening at certain times, allowing oneself a mellowing kind of a time in order to be able to fall asleep at a reasonable hour. These are all incredibly important, to really avoid anything that's adrenaline producing, late in the evening, like, watching Law and Order in the bedroom is not a good idea. That kind of violence can get us worked
Yeah.
up. It's keeping the environment as a whole as positive and holding as possible, avoiding, negative news feeds and negative social media, because negativity tends to breed negativity. It's also important to avoid alcohol, nicotine, caffeine, and recreational drugs. We're a culture that's really addicted to comfort. And so we're conditioned to kind of reach out for those substances, just to relieve our discomfort. I mean, really for medicinal purposes.
Yeah, I know for some people it's really easy to, to just start just to have a drink to relax, but it can move really quickly into a regular habit.
Yes, it can. Yes, it can. But people look for it as a stress reliever. And, it works, but only temporarily, and can lead to more problems down the line.
Yeah, how true. I know, I know they say about what is that, a halt? I think you and I have talked about that before.
Anna, it's one of my favorites. The whole piece about from the 12-step program. Never let yourself get too hungry, angry, lonely,
Yeah,
or tired, because all of these really set us up to be more vulnerable. And when we're more vulnerable, we're more reactive. So, using this can be incredibly important.
yeah, how true. I know I've never made a good decision when I've been in a halt state, Dr. Jane.
Yeah, and if these don't tend to work, then it's really time to get professional help. And you can start with your family physician, or, certainly mental health programs, in our community. Um, and it's important to really work toward providing whatever is needed for the individual who's going through the traumatic process.
Yeah.
Um, because symptoms can sometimes worsen, you
Mhm.
know, and sometimes it leads to an inability to function at work or home. And very often, one of the telltale signs is, real clear social withdrawal and isolation, or reoccurring flashbacks, or another symptom.
Yeah.
Any kind of thoughts of one harming themselves or others. These are real hallmarks of, needing the professional help ASAP.
Yeah.
And there are several available treatment modalities. A lot of backup with very clear, substantial research. I mean, they really do work. There are great success rates. So it's getting together with, you know, those professionals to really give the support that's needed.
Yeah. So if somebody's been doing these techniques on a consistent basis for a very long time and none of these work, they should definitely seek a professional.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And the professionals in our community know about traumatic stress. We have programs, there are services available.
Yeah. All these emotions are so scary. And I hope these recovery suggestions will be very helpful for whomever may be, watching and are suffering from PTSD. I thought, Dr. Jane, it might be helpful next time for us to discuss the family dynamics and too much togetherness that some people are feeling. I know I hear a lot about that these days.
Well, Anna, I think that's a great idea. I think it also extends to, it's families, but also other significant relationships and friendships, because certainly the trauma that we have experienced and, the uncertainties of how things are going to continue to play out are affecting us all, both families and significant relationships, friendships, work associates, all of the social environments that we happen to be involved in. I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, this sounds great. Thank you again for sharing your time and your knowledge with us. I so appreciate it. I can't wait until our next coming together for the good conversation. I'll
Thank
see
you,
you soon,
Anna.
Dr. Jane.
See you as well, Anna. Bye now.
Bye-bye.